Great action so far here on the main event. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Bischoff for WCW this week, and my guest is probably one of the most popular athletes to come into WCW for some time, and Van Hammer. Big win for you earlier today, and certainly the outpouring of support that you're getting from your hammerheads in arenas all over the country has got to make you very happy.
That's right. When Van Hammer hits the arena, it doesn't matter where the battle takes place or who my opponent is. When my hammerheads get behind me and stomp that house, it's like thunder and lightning. And when that hammer energy raises the air up, that means it's an indicator that my opponent's world is about to cave in.
In the early 1990s, WCW was trying to figure out what its future looked like. The company was caught between old-school Southern wrestling traditions and a new era where presentation, music, and larger-than-life characters were starting to matter just as much as what happened in the ring. In that in-between space, WCW introduced a character designed to feel like the next big thing. A rock star with attitude, a guitar, and a look meant to stand out in a crowded roster. That character was Van Hammer. At first glance, he had everything you might expect to work in that era. He looked different, and he had a clear identity. He was positioned as someone who could connect with a younger, more modern wrestling audience. But wrestling is rarely just about how someone looks on paper. It's about timing, storytelling, booking decisions, and whether the company knows what to do with someone once they've been introduced. Van Hammer's career in WCW becomes less about a rise to stardom and more about something quieter and more telling. A character that never fully transformed into what he was meant to be. A push that never quite stabilized. This is the story of Van Hammer, WCW's forgotten rock star. Born and raised in Maryland, Mark Hildreth came from a family already shaped by history. His father had been stationed at Pearl Harbor aboard the USS Nevada during the attack. After high school, Hildreth followed a similar path and joined the Navy. He worked as a machinist, doing steady, unglamorous labor that had little to do with entertainment or performance. It wasn't until later that things began to shift. He got married, and he started training seriously, lifting weights. And in that process, something changed physically, in a way that changed his trajectory entirely. He got big. Very big. As Hildreth would later hear from people around him, he already had the kind of size and look that fit professional wrestling. In a chance meeting, he spoke with the legendary wrestler Sting, who gave him a direct and honest warning about the business. He explained that wrestling could be difficult and unpredictable. It wasn't an easy path. But that warning didn't discourage Hildreth. If anything, it reinforced the idea that this was something worth trying. He went to Tampa and began training under Boris Malenko, entering a class of around 20 aspiring wrestlers. Among them, Hildreth trained and became friends with Mark Marrow. After completing Boris Malenko's training, Hildreth expected the next step to be slow and unglamorous. In wrestling, that usually meant years on the independent circuit, the so-called minor leagues, traveling from small town to small town, learning how to survive before ever being considered for something bigger. But sometimes, wrestling careers don't build gradually. They jump. Hildreth's first stop was a single match for a small promotion called North Georgia Wrestling, an outfit booked by the American Dream Dusty Rhodes, a Hall of Famer and one of the most influential minds in the business. Rhodes had a reputation for seeing potential in unexpected places, and in that environment, both Hildreth and Mark Marrow came into his orbit. Rhodes saw something in Mark Marrow immediately, particularly his unusual look and charisma. He thought Marrow's resemblance to Little Richard could be shaped into a marketable wrestling persona. With that in mind, Rhodes, who was also working with WCW, arranged a tryout. Hildreth went along primarily to lose to Marrow and then likely go back to the Indies. Shortly after the dark match between them at a TV taping, Hildreth was called into a meeting with Dusty Rhodes. Rhodes saw potential and moved quickly, offering him a contract. In an instant, Hildreth went from expecting years on the independent circuit to being signed by the second largest wrestling promotion in the United States. With that came a new identity, one designed to fit the character-driven style of the era. Under Rhodes' direction, he was given a name and a gimmick built for television. Van Hammer had officially arrived in World Championship Wrestling. In September 1991, Hildreth officially entered World Championship Wrestling under a new identity, Heavy Metal Van Hammer. The presentation was immediate and unmistakable. WCW wasn't easing him in, they were introducing him as a statement. A rock star persona built for television, designed to stand out in an era where larger-than-life characters were becoming the centerpiece of the product. His debut came at Clash of the Champions 16, and it was decisive. Hammer was placed in a match against Terrence Taylor, and he beat him in just 39 seconds. It wasn't just a win, it was a squash. The kind of dominant introduction reserved for wrestlers the company wants audiences to take seriously right away. There was no gradual build, no slow adjustment period. From the start, WCW presented him as someone meant to be watched. Hammer was kept on a strong winning streak across both television and house shows, quickly accumulating an undefeated record that reached 42-0. In a business where momentum is carefully manufactured, this was WCW signaling that Van Hammer was not intended to be a mid-card experiment, he was being positioned as a force. The streak would eventually come to an end at Clash of the Champions 17, where he was defeated by Cactus Jack. But even with that loss, Hammer was used in increasingly visible spots. At Starrcade, WCW's flagship event, he teamed with Big Josh in a losing effort against Steve Austin and Rick Rude, two names who would go on to define entirely different eras of wrestling. Even in defeat, Hammer was being placed alongside talent that mattered, positioned in matches designed to elevate everyone involved. From the outside, the push was hard to miss. Diamond Dallas Page, who entered WCW around the same time as Hildreth, said, "He came in with fanfare and a lot of attention." That attention, however, didn't come without consequences behind the scenes. Reports from the time suggested that Hammer's rapid elevation didn't sit well with parts of the locker room. In a company filled with veterans who had spent years paying dues across territories, seeing a newcomer immediately placed on a dominant streak created tension. Some saw it as another example of WCW favoring presentation over process, fast-tracking someone into a spotlight that others felt they had earned through longevity. Behind the booking decisions was Dusty Rhodes, whose creative influence helped shape Hammer's early trajectory. The comparison that circulated internally was telling. Rhodes was reportedly trying to position Van Hammer as WCW's version of the Ultimate Warrior, a loud, high-energy, visually distinct powerhouse meant to connect through spectacle more than technical refinement. But comparisons like that come with expectations, and expectations in wrestling are rarely neutral. They either solidify a performer or expose the gap between concept and reality. And as Van Hammer's push continued, that gap was about to become harder to ignore. After his initial undefeated run and early spotlight matches, Van Hammer settled into a more uneven stretch of his WCW career, one defined less by momentum and more by fluctuation. He remained a recognizable figure on television, but the clear sense of upward trajectory that had defined his debut years began to fade. That was until the most notable opportunity of his career came on the November 21st episode of WCW Worldwide, where Hammer was entered into the Jesse the Body Ventura Strongest Arm tournament with not matches, but arm wrestling contests. A minor but visible surprise, he defeated Vinny Vegas to advance. A few weeks later, on December 12th, Hammer pulled off what was positioned as a significant upset by defeating Big Van Vader to reach the tournament finals against WCW World Heavyweight Champion Ron Simmons. The following week, Hammer defeated the Hall of Famer Simmons to win the arm wrestling challenge. On paper, it was a moment that should have represented a turning point. He had beaten a world champion, even though it wasn't in an actual wrestling match, stood out in a featured segment, and added another accomplishment to his resume. but in practice, it would end up functioning more like a ceiling than a breakthrough. Hammer continued to appear in matches against established names like Sid Vicious and Rick Rude, but those encounters were decisive losses. The booking around him became increasingly familiar, competitive enough to remain on television, but clearly positioned beneath the top tier. He existed in a consistent mid-card cycle, winning matches that didn't carry major stakes and being decisively defeated when the spotlight was truly elevated. Even his arm wrestling crown from the Ventura tournament became a recurring prop rather than a meaningful accolade. The next time they had the event, Van Hammer lost in the first round. By 1993, Hammer received an opportunity to audition for the World Wrestling Federation. He worked matches in both heel and babyface roles during the tryout period, attempting to adapt his presentation to a different system and different expectations. But despite the exposure, he was never offered a contract. By 1995, his run in wrestling slowed significantly, and he stepped away from the industry for a period of time. Allegedly, the reason Van Hammer stepped away was twofold. The office and veterans didn't like his work, and his primary physician was raided and caught selling anabolic steroids. After stepping away from WCW and failing to secure a role elsewhere, he drifted further from the national stage with only occasional appearances and little direction in his career. One story from this period, often repeated in wrestling circles, captures both his absence from the business and the kind of reputation he had developed. At a Christmas party hosted by Diamond Dallas Page, Hildreth reportedly began criticizing WCW's direction, taking aim at the company's use of smaller international talent. The comments escalated, eventually turning towards specific wrestlers including Steven Regal and David Taylor. Regal, who was present at the party, confronted him. What followed was brief and decisive. The situation ended with Regal knocking Hildreth unconscious with a headbutt. Moments like this didn't rebuild Hildreth's career, and they didn't bring him any closer to a major opportunity. If anything, they reflected just how far removed he had become from the position he once held in WCW. But wrestling has a way of circling back. As WCW entered a new era, one defined by Monday Nitro, there was once again a place for familiar faces. And for Hildreth, that meant another opportunity to return. Thanks to the help from Diamond Dallas Page, Hammer was folded into Raven's Flock, one of the more memorable groups of the late 1990s WCW landscape. The Flock thrived on a sense of disillusionment and drift. Wrestlers portrayed as lost, discarded, or directionless under Raven's leadership. In that context, Hammer fit less as a star and more as a body within the system. Another figure absorbed into a larger identity, rather than standing apart from it. Even Raven himself later admitted he was ambivalent about Hildreth joining the group, and that hesitation showed in the booking. Van Hammer, now going simply by Hammer, was rarely positioned as a focal point. It was a clear step down from the way he had originally been introduced years earlier. Rather than being presented as a rising star, he had become part of the background. When the Flock eventually disbanded, Hildreth once again adjusted. He returned to the Van Hammer name and attempted to reinvent himself, continuing a pattern that had followed him throughout his career. Adapting to whatever version of WCW existed at the time, even if it meant starting over. Later, as WCW leaned even further into faction warfare and comedic reinvention, he resurfaced again as part of the Misfits in action under the name Private Stash, a tongue-in-cheek play on words that reflected the company's increasingly cartoonish tone in its later years under Vince Russo. But neither that, or his singles run, recaptured anything resembling lasting momentum. Much like his original Van Hammer push, these characters appeared, functioned for a short period, and then quietly dissolved without leaving a major impact on the overall direction of the company. Still, unlike many wrestlers who came and went during WCW's turbulent years, Hammer remained present. He was not pushed to the top, but he also wasn't fully discarded for most of the company's lifespan. That long, steady presence finally came to an end in 2000. As WCW neared its collapse, Hammer's final televised match came on the July 12, 2000 episode of Thunder, where he wrestled and lost to the Demon. Outside of mainstream wrestling, Hildreth remained active on smaller shows for several more years, moving through the kind of bookings that often define the final stretch of a long wrestling career: less visibility, more travel, and a gradual step away from major platforms. His final recorded match took place in 2009, closing out nearly 2 decades in the ring under various forms of the Van Hammer identity. After stepping away from the ring, Hildreth's life became more private and, at times, unstable. He described taking on various jobs outside wrestling, working in commercial fishing, construction, and other trades, as he tried to adjust to life after the road. Like many longtime wrestlers, the transition was not simple, and he later acknowledged periods of personal struggle along the way. On January 26, 2020, Hildreth was arrested in Palm Beach County, Florida, and charged with DUI and first-degree felony hit-and-run after striking a 5-year-old child riding a bicycle. The child survived, but suffered injuries in the incident. Hildreth later pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to probation, a driver's license suspension, and required monitoring in his vehicle. In the years that followed, he reportedly reconnected with friends from his wrestling days, including Diamond Dallas Page, and began working toward rebuilding stability in his life. On April 19, 2026, news broke that Mark Hildreth had passed away at the age of 66. The announcement was shared by longtime friend Mark Marrow, who confirmed the news publicly. At the time of the report, no official cause of death had been released. Tributes from across the wrestling world quickly followed news of his death, with former colleagues and fans reflecting on a performer who spent nearly his entire career inside WCW's evolving landscape. For many, he remains a familiar figure from a specific era of wrestling, someone who arrived with a heavily promoted identity, lived through every shift of WCW's chaotic rise and fall, and stayed long enough to become part of its history, rather than just a footnote in it. Van Hammer represents a specific kind of wrestler that WCW produced in large numbers. Someone who had the look, was given an opportunity, but was never given the consistency or direction needed to turn that opportunity into something lasting. His story isn't just about one performer. It reflects a broader pattern of missed chances and short-term thinking that defined much of WCW's roster. Even so, he lasted. Through different eras, different gimmicks, and constant change, he remained part of the company for nearly a decade. Not as a star, but as a steady presence in a promotion that often struggled to decide what it wanted to be. Van Hammer may be remembered as WCW's forgotten rock star, but his career says more than that. It shows how easily potential can be recognized, and just as easily wasted. What remains isn't just the memory of the character, but a reminder of how often wrestling started something it never fully finished.